In the heart of a busy city, there was a small courthouse that buzzed with activity every day. People from all walks of life came here, some seeking justice, others trying to resolve disputes, and a few just hoping for answers. On this particular morning, the air felt heavier than usual. The courtroom was packed, filled with murmurs and whispers as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. Among the crowd stood a young woman who looked different from most of the people around her. She wasn't wearing a fancy suit or polished shoes like the lawyers and officials in the room. Instead, she wore light blue scrubs, the kind nurses wear at hospitals, and comfortable sneakers. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, but dark. Circles under her eyes hinted at exhaustion. This was no ordinary day for her. It hadn't been an ordinary week either. Her name wasn't important right now, but her story was about to become unforgettable. She had come straight from a long shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Earlier that morning, she'd received an urgent call asking her to testify in court about one of her patients, a very sick child caught in the middle of a messy custody battle between their parents. It wasn't something she'd planned for, but when duty called, she didn't hesitate. The problem was she hadn't had time to change out of her scrubs before rushing over to the courthouse. Between managing emergencies at work and dealing with the emotional toll of caring for critically ill patients, she barely had time to think about what she was wearing. All she knew was that showing up mattered more than anything else. As she entered the courtroom, clutching her notes tightly, she could feel dozens of eyes on her. Some glanced curiously, while others seemed indifferent. But when the judge entered and took his seat, the atmosphere shifted. Everyone fell silent, waiting for the session to start. That's when things got complicated. The judge, a man known for being strict and formal, scanned the room with sharp eyes. When his gaze landed on the nurse standing near the witness stand, his expression hardened almost instantly. He leaned forward slightly, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a voice loud enough to echo through the entire room. "Young lady," he began, his tone firm and unyielding. "This is a court of law. We expect people to dress appropriately when they appear here. These are not casual clothes you're wearing." The words hit like a thunderclap. For a moment, the nurse froze, unsure how to respond. Every head in the room turned toward her, and she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Was she really being scolded for coming directly from saving lives? She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. Her mind raced with thoughts. Should she apologize? Should she explain why she was dressed this way? Or should she simply stay quiet and let the moment pass? Whatever decision she made next would set the tone for everything that followed. What happened after that changed not only her day, but also left a lasting impact on everyone present in the courtroom. Little did anyone know, this seemingly routine hearing was about to turn into something far greater, a moment that challenged perceptions, sparked conversations, and reminded everyone of the power of standing up for what truly matters. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner. All eyes were fixed on the nurse, who stood frozen in place, her fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. The judge's words still hung heavy in the air, and for a moment, it seemed like she might just bow her head and accept his reprimand without saying a word. But then something shifted. Her shoulders squared slightly, and though exhaustion lined her face, a spark of determination lit up her expression. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly before speaking. Her voice wasn't loud or angry. Instead, it carried a calmness that made people lean forward to listen more closely. "Your Honor," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "I understand that this is a formal setting, and I respect the rules of the court. But these clothes I'm wearing, they aren't just fabric. They mean something." Her words caught everyone off guard. No one expected her to respond, let alone with such poise under pressure. She glanced down at her scrubs for a second, as if gathering her thoughts, then looked back up at the judge. "These scrubs have seen me through some of the hardest moments of my life. Nights when I've stayed awake holding the hand of someone fighting for their next breath. Days when I've comforted families who didn't know how to say goodbye. And yes, even today when I came here directly from caring for a child whose future depends on decisions we're making right now." There was a pause, and the silence grew heavier. You could see the judge's jaw tighten ever so slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he listened intently, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. The gallery, too, remained utterly still, captivated by her words. Some of the spectators exchanged glances, nodding almost imperceptibly, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps feeling guilty for having judged her earlier. "I didn't plan to come here dressed this way," she continued, her voice steady despite the tiredness evident in her posture. "But sometimes life doesn't give us time to prepare. Sometimes you have to choose between stopping to change your clothes or rushing to be where you're needed most. Today I chose to be here because what's happening in this courtroom matters, not just to me but to the patient I care for and the family depending on this process." Her honesty struck a chord. One woman sitting near the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue while a man seated behind her whispered softly to his companion, "She's got a point." Even the defense attorney, who had been scribbling notes furiously until now, stopped writing and leaned back in his chair, watching her intently. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just about what she was wearing anymore. It was about the bigger picture. The nurse wasn't defending herself so much as she was reminding everyone of the humanity behind her job. Nurses, doctors, caregivers, they weren't superheroes clad in capes but ordinary people doing extraordinary work. People who often sacrificed sleep, comfort, and personal needs to put others first. As she spoke, memories flooded back to those in the audience who had encountered healthcare workers in similar situations. A mother recalled the kindness of a nurse who stayed late to explain treatment options. An elderly man remembered the calm reassurance of a paramedic during a medical emergency. These moments, though fleeting, left lasting impressions, and now, standing before them, was someone who embodied that same spirit of selflessness. The judge, however, wasn't ready to let the matter drop. He adjusted his glasses again, his expression unreadable. "Do you mean to suggest," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "that your profession excuses you from following basic standards of conduct?" It was a loaded question, one designed to challenge her further. But the nurse didn't flinch. If anything, his words only strengthened her resolve. She straightened her back, meeting his gaze head-on. "No, Your Honor," she replied firmly. "My profession doesn't excuse me from anything. In fact, it demands more from me than most jobs ever could. It asks me to show up, not perfectly dressed, not always on time, but fully present. Because when someone's health or even their life hangs in the balance, every second counts." Her response rippled through the room like a wave. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, just pure conviction. For many in the audience, it was impossible not to feel moved. Here was someone who had devoted her life to helping others, yet she was being criticized for simply doing her job. It felt unfair, unjust even. And yet, she hadn't raised her voice or pointed fingers. Instead, she had chosen to speak from the heart, sharing truths that resonated deeply with anyone who had ever relied on the compassion of a stranger in a moment of need. Slowly but surely, the tide in the courtroom began to shift, not against the judge, but toward understanding. What happened next would surprise everyone, including the judge himself. But for now, the focus remained on the nurse, whose courage and grace had turned an ordinary courtroom hearing into something far greater, a lesson in empathy, resilience, and the power of standing up for what truly matters. The silence in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Every eye was glued to the nurse as she stood there, her scrubs now seeming less like casual clothing and more like a symbol of sacrifice. The judge's question still lingered in the air, his tone firm, his gaze unwavering. But instead of backing down or letting frustration creep into her voice, she paused for a moment, collecting her thoughts. Then, with quiet determination, she spoke again. "Your Honor," she said, her words deliberate and measured. "I'm not here to argue about rules or challenge what's expected of me. I respect this court, and I understand why appearances matter. But if we're talking about standards, then let's also talk about the standard of care, the kind of care that keeps people alive, gives families hope, and reminds us all that behind every case, there's a human being who needs help." Her voice softened slightly, but it carried an undeniable strength. When I woke up this morning, I didn't know I'd be standing here. I didn't plan for any of this. What I did plan for was another long day at the hospital, where my job isn't just a job, it's a calling. It's about showing up when no one else can, staying late when everyone else has gone home, and doing whatever it takes to make sure my patients feel seen, heard, and cared for. She glanced briefly at the gallery, her eyes scanning the faces, watching her intently. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, but all were captivated. She continued, "These scrubs have been with me through some of the toughest moments of my life. They've soaked up sweat, tears, and sometimes even blood. They've witnessed joy when a patient pulls through against all odds, and they've shared grief when things don't go the way we pray for." For a split second, her voice wavered, not out of weakness, but because the weight of everything she carried inside came rushing to the surface. She took another deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "To ask me to apologize for wearing them feels wrong. Not because I think I'm above the rules, but because these clothes represent something bigger than me, something bigger than this room. They remind us that life is fragile, unpredictable, and precious." By now, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted entirely. Earlier, there had been judgment in the air, a sense that she was out of place, unprepared, maybe even disrespectful. But now that feeling had dissolved. In its place was something else, empathy. People began to see her not as someone who had broken protocol, but as a person who had chosen compassion over convenience, duty over comfort. Even the judge seemed affected, though he tried hard not to show it. His stern expression softened ever so slightly, and for a brief moment his guard dropped. He leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully as if seeing her for the first time. The tension between them wasn't hostile anymore. It felt more like a conversation, one that challenged both sides to think deeper. But the turning point came when she added, almost as an afterthought, "If my presence here today makes anyone uncomfortable, perhaps it's because it forces us to confront something we often forget, that humanity matters more than appearances ever could." The words hung in the air, heavy yet hopeful. For many in the room, they struck a nerve. A young mother sitting near the back dabbed at her eyes, remembering the nurse who had stayed by her child's bedside during a terrifying illness. An older man nodded slowly, recalling the paramedic who had saved his life years ago. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and unflinching, couldn't help but glance at her with newfound respect. Then, without warning, something extraordinary happened. A woman seated in the front row, a stranger to the nurse, slowly rose to her feet. At first, no one noticed, but then she started clapping. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a soft, rhythmic sound that broke the silence. Heads turned toward her, surprised, but soon others joined in. One by one, people stood up, their applause growing louder and more heartfelt. It was spontaneous, genuine, and impossible to ignore. The entire courtroom erupted into applause, the kind that sends shivers down your spine and makes you believe in the goodness of people. Even the lawyers, who moments ago had been scribbling notes and whispering strategies, stopped what they were doing to join in. The defense attorney gave a small nod of approval, while the prosecutor smiled faintly, clearly moved by the moment. The judge watched it all unfold, his expression unreadable. For a man known for his strict adherence to order, this was unfamiliar territory. Yet there was no denying the power of what had just happened. Here was a woman who, despite being reprimanded, had managed to unite a room full of strangers with nothing more than honesty and courage. When the clapping finally died down, the judge raised his hand to restore order. The room fell silent once, again anticipation hanging in the air. Everyone wondered how he would respond next. Would he double down on his earlier statement? Or would he acknowledge the shift that had taken place? What followed was unexpected and unforgettable. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a tone that was noticeably softer than before. "Miss," he began, his voice carrying a hint of humility, "you've given us much to reflect on today. While I stand by the importance of decorum in this court, I must admit that your dedication to your work has left a profound impression, not only on me, but on everyone present here." He paused, looking around the room as if taking in the collective emotion. Then, surprising everyone, he excused himself briefly. Moments later, he returned holding a spare robe, the kind judges and lawyers wear during proceedings. Walking over to the witness stand, he handed it to her with a gesture that was both respectful and symbolic. "Perhaps this will serve as a compromise," he said, his tone sincere. "Wear it with pride, knowing that your actions speak louder than any garment ever could." Tears welled up in the nurse's eyes as she accepted the robe, draping it over her shoulders. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she allowed herself to feel relief and gratitude. The room erupted into applause once again, this time even louder than before. It was a moment that transcended the boundaries of the law, reminding everyone present of the values that truly mattered: compassion, understanding, and the shared humanity that connects us all. The applause in the courtroom didn't die down quickly. It lingered, filling the space with a warmth that felt almost electric. People weren't just clapping. They were standing up, some nodding their heads, others whispering to one another, clearly moved by what had just unfolded. For a moment, it wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a room full of human beings who had been reminded of something they often forgot: the power of empathy and the importance of seeing beyond appearances. The nurse, still holding the judge's robe in her hands, took a step back from the witness stand. Her face was flushed, not from embarrassment but from emotion. She hadn't expected any of this, not the applause, not the standing ovation, and certainly not the judge's gesture of handing her his robe. It was overwhelming, but in a way that made her feel seen for the first time that day. She glanced around the room, her eyes meeting those of strangers who were now smiling at her. A few people even gave her thumbs up or small nods of encouragement. One older gentleman near the back wiped his glasses with a handkerchief, clearly trying to hide the fact that he'd been wiping away tears. The atmosphere had shifted completely. It wasn't tense or formal anymore. It felt alive, connected, and deeply human. The judge, too, seemed different. Earlier, he had been stern, unyielding, and focused solely on maintaining the dignity of the court. But now there was a softness in his demeanor. He sat quietly, watching as the room buzzed with energy. When the applause finally began to fade, he cleared his throat gently, bringing everyone's attention back to him. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice steady but kinder than before. "This is a court of law, and I will always uphold its standards. However," he paused, looking directly at the nurse, "I believe there are times when exceptions must be made, not because rules don't matter, but because humanity does." His words hung in the air, simple yet profound. No one spoke. No one even dared to breathe loudly. Everyone knew they were witnessing something rare, a moment where authority met humility, where rigid structures bent slightly to make room for compassion. The judge continued, "Miss, you've reminded all of us today that our roles, whether as judges, lawyers, nurses, or citizens, are ultimately about serving others. And sometimes service requires sacrifice. You've shown up here today not for yourself but for someone else. That deserves recognition." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. "So, let this serve as a lesson, for me, for everyone in this room, and perhaps for anyone who hears about this later. Let's remember that while appearances have their place, character and intent matter more. They define us far more than the clothes we wear or the titles we hold." As he finished speaking, the gallery erupted into applause again. This time, it wasn't just for the nurse. It was also for the judge, whose willingness to acknowledge his own rigidity and adapt in the face of truth earned him respect. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and reserved, cracked a small smile, shaking his head in admiration. Once the noise settled, the proceedings resumed, but the tone of the entire hearing had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by a sense of unity and understanding. The defense attorney, who had been combative earlier, softened his approach during cross-examination. Instead of grilling the nurse with tough questions, he asked thoughtful ones, acknowledging the weight of her responsibilities and the sacrifices she made daily. The prosecutor followed suit, treating her testimony with the seriousness and respect it deserved. For her part, the nurse answered every question honestly and calmly, She didn't shy away from sharing difficult truths about the child's condition, nor did she sugarcoat the challenges faced by healthcare workers. Her responses were clear, heartfelt, and grounded in reality. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she had left an indelible mark on the case and on everyone present. But the story didn't end there. As she walked out of the courtroom, several people approached her to thank her. Some simply shook her hand, while others offered words of gratitude. One woman hugged her tightly, saying, "Thank you for reminding us what really matters." Another man pressed a business card into her palm, insisting she call if she ever needed anything. These gestures might have seemed small, but they carried immense weight. They showed her that her courage hadn't gone unnoticed. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited eagerly for a statement. Word of the incident had spread quickly, thanks to social media posts from spectators inside the courtroom. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust toward her, and questions came rapid fire. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she handled it all with grace. Standing on the steps of the courthouse, wearing the judge's robe over her scrubs, she addressed the crowd. "I didn't come here today looking for attention," she said, her voice strong despite her obvious exhaustion. "I came here to do my job, to speak for someone who couldn't speak for themselves. If anything good comes from this, I hope it's that people start seeing caregivers in a new light. We're not heroes. We're just doing what needs to be done. But maybe, just maybe, we can all agree that showing up, no matter how tired, how busy, or how unprepared you feel, is worth something." Her words resonated deeply, not just with the reporters but with anyone watching online or reading about it later. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags like DARS, Scrubs Not Suits, and Respect the Caregivers began trending within hours. Messages poured in from nurses, doctors, paramedics, and other frontline workers, thanking her for representing them so boldly. Parents shared stories of how healthcare workers had saved their children's lives. Patients recounted moments when a nurse's kindness had made all the difference. What started as a single incident in a small courtroom had become a movement, a reminder that behind every uniform, every role, and every responsibility, there's a person giving their all. And while the world may not always notice or appreciate it, acts of courage and compassion have a way of rippling outward, touching lives far beyond what anyone could imagine. As the sun set that evening, the nurse finally returned home, exhausted, but fulfilled. She hung the judge's robe carefully in her closet, a keepsake of a day she would never forget. It wasn't just a symbol of compromise. It was proof that standing firm in your truth, even when it's hard, can spark change. Change that starts with one person, one moment, and one choice to speak up. The days following the courtroom incident were unlike anything the nurse could have imagined. What had started as a routine morning, filled with the usual chaos of hospital life, had turned into a whirlwind of attention and emotion. By the time she stepped back into her scrubs the next day at work, it felt surreal to return to the familiar rhythm of caring for patients, administering medications, and comforting families. But even in the quiet moments, she couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. Her co-workers greeted her with hugs and wide smiles, many of them having seen snippets of the news coverage online. "You're famous," one of them joked, holding up their phone to show her a video clip of her standing ovation in the courtroom. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm not famous," she replied. "I just did what I always do. Showed up." But showing up wasn't just about being physically present. It was about bringing your whole self to the task, no matter how hard or thankless it might seem. And that's exactly what resonated with people across the country. The story of the nurse who stood her ground in court went viral almost overnight. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a powerful moment of humanity triumphing over rigid rules. Social media buzzed with support, and hashtags like Flasher, Scrubs Not Suits, and Respect the Caregivers trended for days. What struck a chord with so many wasn't just the dramatic courtroom scene, it was the underlying message. People began sharing their own stories of gratitude toward healthcare workers. A mother posted about the nurse who stayed late to explain her baby's treatment plan. A man recounted how a paramedic saved his father during a heart attack, staying calm and kind despite the urgency of the situation. Another person wrote about the doctor who held their hand while delivering devastating news, offering comfort when words failed. These stories flooded comment sections, forums, and group chats, creating a ripple effect of appreciation and reflection. Organizations that supported nurses and other caregivers seized the opportunity to highlight the challenges they faced daily: long hours, emotional tolls, and often inadequate resources. Campaigns urging communities to show more respect and understanding for frontline workers gained traction, with petitions circulating to improve working conditions and mental health support for those in the field. Back at the courthouse, the impact was equally profound. Judge Harrison found himself reflecting on the incident long after the hearing ended. He hadn't expected his decision to offer the robe to spark such a reaction, not just from the audience but within himself. Known for his strict adherence to protocol, he realized that sometimes flexibility and empathy were just as important as maintaining order. In interviews later, he admitted that the nurse's response had challenged him to rethink how he approached his role as a judge. "It's easy to get caught up in the rules and forget the human element," he said during a televised interview. "That day I learned something valuable, not just about others but about myself. Sometimes justice isn't just about fairness, it's about compassion." His words earned him praise from unexpected quarters. Legal professionals, typically wary of judges admitting any form of vulnerability, applauded his candor. Law students discussed the case in classrooms, debating where to draw the line between enforcing standards and embracing exceptions. Even critics of the legal system acknowledged that this moment had added a layer of relatability to an institution often seen as cold and impersonal. For the nurse, though, life didn't change dramatically, at least not outwardly. She continued her shifts at the hospital, tending to patients with the same dedication she always had. But there was a subtle shift inside her. She carried herself differently now, not because she felt superior or celebrated, but because she knew she'd made a difference. When colleagues asked if she regretted speaking up, she shook her head firmly. "If I stayed silent, I wouldn't be true to who I am," she told them, and maybe someone else would have doubted themselves next time. Still, the newfound attention wasn't without its challenges. Strangers stopped her in public places, grocery stores, coffee shops, even gas stations, to thank her or share their own experiences with healthcare workers. While flattering, it also reminded her of how rare such moments of acknowledgement were. Why did it take a courtroom drama for people to recognize the sacrifices caregivers made every single day? Determined to channel the spotlight into something meaningful, she began speaking at events hosted by nursing associations and advocacy groups. Her talks weren't polished speeches, but heartfelt conversations about resilience, purpose, and the importance of supporting one another. She encouraged others in her profession to speak up when they felt undervalued, reminding them that their voices mattered. "We don't do this job for recognition," she often said, "but we deserve respect, not just from patients and families, but from society as a whole." As weeks turned into months, the initial fervor around her story began to fade, replaced by quieter, more enduring changes. Hospitals implemented new programs to celebrate the contributions of their staff, from simple gestures like handwritten thank you notes to larger initiatives like peer support networks. Schools invited her to talk to students considering careers in healthcare, inspiring young minds to pursue paths rooted in service and compassion. Yet, through it all, the nurse remained grounded. She didn't seek fame or accolades. She simply wanted to keep doing her job the best way she knew how. Every time she slipped on her scrubs, she remembered the courtroom, the applause, the tears, the judge's unexpected kindness, and allowed it to fuel her resolve. Because deep down, she understood that the real victory wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever shown up, given their all, and refused to let the world overlook the humanity behind the uniform. Months passed and life settled into a new kind of rhythm for the nurse. The whirlwind of attention had slowed down, but its effects lingered in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to countless others, who saw themselves in her struggle and triumph. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that standing up for what you believe in can spark change, even when it feels like no one is listening. At work, things were different now, not because her daily tasks had changed, but because the atmosphere around her shifted. Colleagues approached her with renewed energy, sharing how her courage inspired them to speak their minds more openly. Patients and families treated the hospital staff with a deeper level of respect, often going out of their way to express gratitude. One elderly man left handwritten notes for the nurses on his floor, thanking them for their quiet bravery. Another family brought homemade cookies to the ward, simply saying, "We heard about everything you do, thank you." These small acts of kindness might have seemed insignificant, but they meant the world to the people receiving them. For years, healthcare workers had been told indirectly, and sometimes directly, that their efforts went unnoticed. Now, thanks to the ripple effect of that courtroom moment, there was a growing awareness of just how vital their roles truly were. Outside of work, the nurse found herself stepping into a role she never imagined: an advocate. She started attending conferences and panel discussions, not as someone seeking fame, but as someone wanting to amplify the voices of those in her field. At these events, she didn't talk about herself much. Instead, she shared stories from other nurses, doctors, paramedics, and caregivers, the unsung heroes working tirelessly behind the scenes. "I'm just one person," she would say during these talks. "But if my story helps people see the bigger picture, then it's worth telling again and again." Her words resonated deeply with audiences, whether they were fellow healthcare professionals or ordinary citizens curious about the realities of caregiving. People began to understand that being a nurse wasn't just about wearing scrubs or checking vitals. It was about carrying the weight of human suffering while still finding strength to offer comfort. They realized that every interaction between a caregiver and a patient was a thread in the fabric of humanity, fragile yet incredibly strong. The movement sparked by her courtroom stand grew beyond anything she could have predicted. Non-profit organizations launched campaigns aimed at improving workplace conditions for healthcare workers. Lawmakers introduced bills addressing issues like burnout, mental health support, and fair wages for frontline staff. Social media continued to buzz with messages of appreciation, with hashtags like "Caregivers Matter" trending periodically as reminders of the ongoing need for recognition and reform. Even schools started incorporating lessons about empathy and resilience into their curriculums, using her story as an example of how one act of bravery can inspire thousands. Young students wrote essays about what it means to serve others selflessly, while aspiring nurses looked to her as proof that their future careers could make a real difference in the world. Back home, the nurse kept the judge's robe folded neatly in her closet. It wasn't something she wore often. In fact, she rarely took it out. But it served as a symbol of that pivotal day. Whenever doubt crept in, whenever she felt overwhelmed by the demands of her job, she'd glance at the robe and remember the power of speaking truthfully and standing firm in her values. It reminded her that even in moments of vulnerability, there was strength in authenticity. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she sat alone in her living room, scrolling through social media. A video caught her eye. It was a tribute made by a group of nurses from another state. In the clip, they stood together, holding signs that read, "Because of you, we feel seen." Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched. These weren't people she knew personally, but they felt connected through shared experiences and mutual respect. That night, she reflected on everything that had happened since that day in court. She thought about the judge's initial scolding, the standing ovation, and the judge's eventual gesture of handing over his robe. She thought about the strangers who reached out to thank her, the colleagues who rallied around her, and the patients whose lives she touched every day without expecting anything in return. Most of all, she thought about how one moment of honesty had ignited a fire that refused to die out. As she turned off the lights and prepared for bed, she smiled softly to herself. Life hadn't become easier. There were still sleepless nights, emotional challenges, and moments when the weight of her responsibilities felt unbearable. But she carried something new with her now, a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. She knew that what mattered most wasn't perfection or accolades. It was showing up day after day and giving her best to the people who needed her. And so, the story came full circle. What began as a single act of defiance in a courtroom ended as a testament to the enduring power of compassion and courage. The nurse returned to her work the next morning, slipping on her scrubs with pride. Each stitch represented not just her profession, but also the humanity she fought to honor every single day. In the end, the true legacy of that day wasn't confined to headlines or hashtags. It lived on in the hearts of everyone who dared to care a little deeper, try a little harder, and believe that even the smallest actions could leave the biggest impact. Because in a world often divided by rules and appearances, her story proved that humanity always finds a way to shine through.